Hello, and welcome to the Geocurrents Lecture Series on the historical geography of U.S. presidential elections. This lecture is the second to last in this series. It will cover presidential elections from 2000 to 2012, or in other words, covering the administrations of George W. Bush and Barack Obama. We'll begin a little before the 2000 election in the second term of Bill Clinton. This was a period where the U.S. budget deficit went into reverse, and actually the U.S. had a budget surplus for a few years. You could see that the last 3 years of Clinton's administration and into the first year of George W. Bush's administration. Even though Clinton was governing as a centrist, he still had deep opposition from most Republicans, and a lot of this opposition was over moral or ethical issues, particularly sexual liaisons. And in 1998 and into 1999, Clinton was impeached by the House. He was not convicted and was not removed from office. This had to do with the Monica Lewinsky sexual scandal, and it was essentially over the issue of whether Clinton had perjured himself. Although this was a very popular move in Republican circles, it was not very popular for the U.S. public at large. Most Americans saw it as something of a distraction and not a serious issue, so it did not help the Republican anti-Clinton cause. In the 2000 campaign, the Republicans' choice was basically between George W. Bush, son of former President George Herbert Walker Bush, and John McCain of Arizona, often noted as a maverick because he quite often went against the Republican consensus, particularly on issues of reform. Bush got the support of the Republican establishment at this time. In the nomination battle, George Bush stressed what he called compassionate conservatism, as sort of a more conservatism with softer edges, if you will, and vowed to be an education president, really wanted to change the way reading was taught and move back to phonics, away from what was often called whole language education, which he saw as leading to declining reading scores. He also pledged to continue the Republican policy of federal tax cuts. McCain campaigned more as a reformer, particularly in regard to campaign finance reform. If you look at the map and the graphic to the left, you'll see that in the primaries and caucuses, George W. Bush quite handily defeated McCain. McCain got a lot of support in New England. You could see Vermont, New Hampshire, Massachusetts, Connecticut, Rhode Island, his own Arizona, and then Michigan. New England has generally been noted for its more centrist and reform-oriented Republicans than the rest of the country. Michigan falls into that category to a certain extent as well. The Democrats, on the other hand, had a much clearer contest. So Al Gore, who had been vice president under Bill Clinton and had the support of the Democratic, at least most of the Democratic political establishment, was contested by Bill Bradley of New Jersey, former basketball player, but also a well-known political figure. Bradley campaigned to the left of Gore. Gore at this time was still regarded himself as a more of a centrist, center-left candidate, where Bill Bradley wanted to take that surplus that had been accumulated during the last 3 years of the Clinton administration and spend it on social programs. He also campaigned on gun control and, like John McCain, campaigned finance reform. But you can see on the map that Al Gore took every state in the primaries and caucuses, so it wasn't even a close contest. In the presidential campaign between Gore and Bush, Gore stressed centrism, continuity, and experience, not surprising considering the fact that he had been vice president and the U.S. economy was certainly doing very well, especially in the second half of Clinton's administration. There was quite a bit of optimism, although there was also concern about a bit of a slip in this year in 2000 in the economy, particularly in high tech. There was concern over the so-called year 2000 bug, where a lot of programs, computer programs didn't really have a calendar going beyond the year 2000. And that cost some money, but it was not the disaster that some people thought. George W. Bush campaigned on values, on the theme that Bill Clinton himself was of questionable morality, particularly again on sexual issues and a desire for more integrity. He also campaigned in opposition to nation building, which is something he had accused the Clinton administration of doing in places like Somalia or Kosovo. Rather ironic because after Bush becomes president, the U.S. government under Bush turns very heavily to nation building in Afghanistan and Iraq in particular. And again, a compassionate conservative, which I mentioned before. They were not the only two candidates to matter here. Ralph Nader, a crusading attorney who had fought very hard against the U.S. automobile companies and unsafe cars and for consumer protectionism in general, joined the Green Party, which is quite far to the left on many issues. He was not happy with Clinton and Gore's centrism on economic issues and turned instead to corporate accountability and reform, pushed environmental protection. I perhaps didn't mention in the previous slide, but this is something that Al Gore campaigned on very heavily, and for both Gore and Nader, particularly climate change. Nader, unlike Gore or Bush, was very much opposed to economic globalization, outsourcing of U.S. Manufacturing capacity to other countries. He also campaigned on workers' rights and economic justice, wanted universal health care, something a lot of Democrats had campaigned on back to Harry Truman. But the party had sort of moved away from that especially after Clinton's failed attempt to create a government-supported, not a government-supported healthcare system, something that's called Hillary Care. Nader also campaigned on an anti-war foreign policy. So a lot of campaign promises or campaign platforms that were geared to traditional left-wing concerns. The election turned out to be very close. Neither of the candidates getting a majority. In the electoral vote, George W. Bush eventually prevailed, although it took a Supreme Court case. In the popular vote, Gore won by a pretty narrow amount, a few 100,000 votes. And if you look at the electoral map, it's pretty close to the 2020 electoral map, but with some big differences. Florida went to Bush, but extremely narrowly. We'll look at this in the next slide. But Gore had the entire Pacific coast and New Mexico, usually a Democratic voting state, though notice not Colorado, which has definitely shifted into the blue category since 2000. Gore also took Iowa, which has shifted into the red category since this period. Virginia was also taken by Bush. That has shifted into the blue category. And Bush also took New Hampshire, which has shifted essentially into the blue category, although it's close to being a swing state. As I mentioned before, this election was essentially decided in Florida, where the election was statistically very close to a tie. You could see the percentage 48.847 versus 48.838. So it's only a few tens of thousands of votes. I'm jumping ahead a little bit, but it is really interesting to compare that 2000 county level vote in Florida with the 2024, because one of the big changes in U.S. electoral geography has been the shift of Florida from being the quintessential swing state to a decidedly red or Republican state. In 2024, only a few counties were taken by Kamala Harris, a heavily black part in the northern central panhandle, a county where Gainesville and the University of Florida is. We got Orange County with Orlando, and Palm Beach and Broward counties just north of Miami. I'll talk about that more when I talk about the 2024 election. The big issue legal issue here in the Florida recount had to do with this issue of hanging chads with these ballots that are punched out and not necessarily fully punched out. So it took a lot of examination of these, and a lot of them it's sort of uncertain whether what the intention was on some of these. And a recount was going on in the Supreme Court, eventually ended that recount in a 5-4 decision, which threw the election to George W. Bush, despite the fact that he had lost the popular vote. Well, the popular vote doesn't really count, does it? It's the electoral vote that counts. If we look at the county map, we're beginning to see the emergence of the modern map, or the map of current times. Not quite yet, though. You can see very strong Democratic support in South Texas. Well, that has changed recently. We'll talk about that later on. But we can see Massachusetts, for example, Rhode Island, Connecticut, all counties going for the Democratic candidate. There's just a few areas of white majority rural counties still supporting the Democratic Party. There's a cluster of blue counties in eastern Iowa, southwestern Wisconsin, a bit into little bit in southern Minnesota, although not so many. Also northwestern Illinois. There's also a couple of clusters of white majority rural counties in Arkansas, Tennessee, and even into eastern Kentucky and West Virginia, voting for the Democratic Party. That is going to change. A little more interesting to look at the other map, and this is mostly the Ralph Nader map. There are a few other independents running, or people running on minor political parties, but most of these other votes were for the Green Party candidate, Ralph Nader. It's an interesting collection of counties where Nader did very well. Mendocino County in California, part of the so-called Golden Triangle. That's a rural county, but a lot of back-to-the-landers moved there in the late 60s, early 70s, and took very strongly environmentalist positions with them. Missoula County in Montana, where the University of Montana is, long known as the center of green activism. Interesting to see in Utah, one county there with the third highest level of support for Ralph Nader, for 15% essentially. That's Grand County, where Moab is a real center of outdoor recreation. Similarly, in Colorado, the highest percentage of the vote was San Miguel County, where Telluride is, areas in the west with ski resorts attracting a lot of wealthy skiers and not so wealthy ski bums and instructors. On both sides of that, you get a lot of people with strongly environmentalist views. Douglas County in Kansas, where the University of Kansas is, and Lawrence, Travis County in Austin, California, Texas, and the seat of the University of Texas. Cook County in Minnesota, that's a very lightly populated area, tourist-oriented, a lot of outdoor recreation. And then finally, I just noted Tompkins County in New York, where Ithaca and Cornell University are, and then Hampshire County in western Massachusetts, where there's a number of small liberal arts colleges. Demographic patterns are not too surprising. The gender gap is pretty pronounced in this election. If you remember from previous elections, that's a relatively new phenomenon. It had not been as strongly noted in most earlier elections. If you go back to the Eisenhower period, especially in Eisenhower's second election, Eisenhower's a Republican candidate, got actually a higher percentage of the female vote than did Adlai Stevenson. On race, it's very clear. We have Bush substantially winning the white vote. And this is a period where we really see this strong bifurcation of the white vote tending to be more Republican and the non-white vote tending to go for the Democrats. So you can see a black vote overwhelmingly, 90%. Asian, not quite so strong, although still essentially into landslide territory. And with the Hispanic vote, you could see basically 2-1 Democratic advantage. This was a period when there was a lot of speculation that the demographic changes in the United States, increasing percentage of non-white voters, meant that the Democrats would win most elections going out because they had such a strong advantage in non-white voting groups. I've talked about this a little bit before, at least in the initial lectures in this series. John Judas and Rui Teixeira, Democratic analysts and political thinkers, wrote a book at this time called The Emerging Democratic Majority, based on this demographic pattern and growing numbers of non-white voters. That is going to change in the Trump era, particularly in the 2024 election. So I will talk about that quite a bit. In age, it's kind of interesting. Not much difference in this election. It's pretty similar across the age clusters here. Bush won only one group, 30 to 49 years old, but the rest are quite close. Sexual orientation is now being polled. These are all based on exit polls, I should say, and you should take these with a grain of salt because they're by no means certain. They're estimates, but they're rough, decent estimates and the best that we have. We see, no surprise, a big gap between gay, lesbian, and bisexual people. It's essentially that's 3-to-1 gap. And then in income, it's the traditional difference between Democrats and Republicans. The poorer people are, the more Democratic voting their pattern tends to be. So you can just look at this in the income categories from under 15,000, 38% for Bush, and then rising up to 55 by the time you get over 100,000. That is also going to change in the Trump era. Union households, a clear victory for the Democrats. I do want to note that in the Reagan period, union households voted almost as heavily for the Republican candidate as the Democratic candidates, but we're back more to the traditional situation with heavy union support, but not overwhelming by any means. In the congressional elections in the same year, 2000, pretty close. The Republicans actually lose seats in both the House and the Senate. You could see the Republicans in the Senate losing 4 seats and retaining a very narrow control. With after the election, the Republicans have 50 seats, the Democrats have 50 seats. When it's tied, the vice president gets to vote, so that gives the Republicans an edge, but the narrowest edge possible. You can see very interestingly the Democrats winning in at least one state that is now quite deep red, Missouri, in the center of the country, and picking up a number of seats in scattered parts of the U.S. In Bush's first term, foreign affairs intruded heavily, as they did in his father's presidency. Like with his father, initially they helped the president, George W. Bush in this case. So first was 9/11, and then followed by the U.S. Sending troops into Afghanistan and very quickly overthrowing the Taliban Islamist regime. This was supported by most people in the United States after the trauma of 9/11. A couple years later, it was followed by the invasion of Iraq, much more controversial, although it did get congressional support from both Republicans overwhelmingly and from a lot of Democrats as well. The United States was assured, the American public, I say, was assured that Saddam Hussein in Iran was building weapons of mass destruction, nuclear, chemical, biological, or otherwise. It turned out to be untrue. But the invasion was initially very successful, and the U.S. Quite easily overthrew Saddam Hussein and his government, and this was seen initially by a majority of people as a great victory. So it's interesting to look at Bush's approval rating after 9/11 and the invasion of Afghanistan, the overthrow. His approval rating skyrocketed from about 52 to 90%, dropped, but it went up again in 2003 after the invasion of Iraq, and then started to decline again with some ups and downs. But the real problems of the U.S. occupation of Iraq didn't become apparent until after 2004. That's when the insurgency, the anti American insurgency in Iraq, really builds up. So at the time of the election, many voters still saw this as a major success for the U.S. military. In the 2004 election, run up to the election, the Democrats turned to John Kerry from Massachusetts, a well known senator. Uh, One advantage Kerry had, at least was seen as an advantage by many, was extensive military experience in Vietnam. He had been a platoon leader, but then he turned against the Vietnam War, as indeed did most Americans. So this was seen as giving him a lot of military credibility in an election where military issues were very important. John Edwards from North Carolina, somewhat populist and a popular political figure, reputation as a reformist. Challenges Kerry. You can see he gets 20% of the votes. Howard Dean of Vermont was widely seen at the beginning as the leader, was leading having the greatest chances to get the nomination. Many voters turned against him, and he was seen as a bit too unstable and not as experienced as someone like John Kerry. And if you look at the map, you could see that Dean took his, again, this is both primaries and caucuses, but Dean took his own Vermont, Edwards his own North Carolina, as well as South Carolina, and then a military figure, Wesley Clark, taking Oklahoma. But it wasn't really a close nomination battle. John Kerry was the clear winner. And at this, we have a situation at this period where victories in the Iowa caucuses and the New Hampshire primary, the first contest, if one has decisive victories, that can really give them momentum, as indeed occurred with Kerry. George W. Bush campaign. Note the Top Gun campaign illustration here on the left. But Bush campaigned very heavily on his military success and against what he called the war on terrorism. He also really wanted to move the U.S. to what he called an ownership society. So he wanted much greater ownership of housing, get people out of renting into ownership. This led to a lot of very lax loans going out to people who really weren't financially qualified. But at this period, it still looked quite successful because more people were able to buy housing. Bush also wanted at least partial privatization of Social Security. Many people in this party wanted full privatization. This was not a popular program for the U.S. government, but it was sold sort of a soft sell at this point. John Kerry was attacked by Republican political operatives very heavily over his military record in Vietnam, where he commanded a swift boat, a very fast river boat, a lot of rivers, and especially in the southern part of South Vietnam. There was actually a group of veterans who had been on these swift boats who organized against him and claimed that he was not adequately loyal to the United States. And this led to a term called swift boating, referring to the honest or misleading tactics to attack or smear the reputation or character of a political opponent. I should say there's nothing new in this. I mean, this goes back to the first U.S. presidential elections, as I've talked about at some length. So it's not a new tactic, but it was widely seen, certainly by Democrats, as an underhanded attack on him. Kerry's main themes were to criticize the way the Iraq War was being carried out, to criticize Bush's tax cuts on the wealthy. And again, he did follow through on promises to reduce the tax rate. It wasn't just on the wealthy, but Democrats certainly said it was disproportionately on the wealthy. Also wanted an emphasis on renewable energy, much more than Bush was giving it. And as is common among Democratic candidates, wanted healthcare reform, more government intervention to allow people to get health insurance. campaigned on abortion rights and in favor of embryonic stem cell research, which was very controversial at the time because the stem cells being taken from embryos. So the election in 2004 turned out to be quite close, but George W. Bush won it clearly. You could see won the popular vote and a majority, a slight majority, but 50.7%. The Electoral College, though, still very close, 286 to 251. One substantial state would have changed that. You could see at this time Virginia still in the Republican camp. That's not going to last much longer. Colorado still in the Republican camp. That's not going to last much longer. Otherwise, this is a map that has often been used to describe the so-called blue wall of reliably Democratic voting states, the three on the Pacific coast, the sort of upper Great Lakes states of Michigan, Wisconsin, Minnesota, and Illinois, and then the entire Northeast, all of New England and all of the mid-Atlantic states. County vote, we've seen these same patterns, not much of a change from previously, so I won't go into this much at all. Those very dark blue counties in South Dakota that you could see are seats of American Indian reservations. There's also a few very similar counties in Montana. The blue counties in the South are mostly black majority or large plurality. A decreasing number of white majority counties in the South, although there are still some. They are going to diminish steadily from election to election as we go forward. It's interesting to see the purple shading map on this, where you can see large zones of the country are purple, pretty close. Bright red areas are mostly in the Great Plains, especially the South and Central Great Plains, and some of the interior West states like Idaho and Utah. And then quite dark blue on the coast in black majority counties, some of them more urban counties, most of New England, particularly Massachusetts. I really like this cartogram. I wish I could have cartograms like this for all elections, because you can really see also the emerging pattern of rural voters turning to the Republican Party, urban voters more to the Democratic Party. So when you look and say the center of this map, you can see a number of purple shapes. Those are urban counties, metropolitan counties. And then you could see they're set within a red matrix of rural voters, and you can see some of those rural areas extending into other parts of the country as well. So this is essentially the pattern that we have now. There have been some changes, actually, in the 2024 election, some lessening of the deep blue of major cities, but I will talk about that in the next week's lecture. Anyway, after this 2004 election, things go bad for the United States in both Iraq and Afghanistan with mounting insurgency. The U.S. military was easily able to win conventional wars against the government of Iraq, and even Afghanistan was something like a conventional war, although not exactly. But then the guerrilla war comes up in both countries, and that's very hard for the U.S. to deal with. So you can see this real surge of U.S. casualties in both countries. And it's especially in George W. Bush's second administration where most of those casualties occur. Also, you get a surge in deficits, and this is a combination of more tax cuts, which came under George W. Bush, and then a lot of spending, a lot of military spending, but also a lot of social expenditure as well. Not as much as would have happened under a Republican administration, but more social spending than was wanted by many staunch conservatives. Also, you had in 2005 one of the most expensive and deadliest tropical storms, Hurricane Katrina, hitting New Orleans, and the federal response was widely seen as ineffective. There are big debates over that. Republicans say the real problems were with state and local officials. Democrats put most of the blame on the federal government, but it did cost George Bush support. And with those issues in our mind, we can pretty easily understand the dynamics of the 2006 midterm elections, where the Democrats made really substantial gains in the House. You could see winning 31 extra seats, gaining control of the House of Representatives. As the map shows you, many parts of the country, those dark blue congressional districts won by Democrats, quite a few in the Midwest. The Democrats still have substantial support in farm areas. You could see there wasn't a win, but the Democrats, each North and South Dakota had, they only have one member of the House, but it's Democrat in this term. You could see in New England, basically almost a total turn to the Democratic Party, and a lot of gains in even in quite conservative states like Indiana, well, particularly Indiana, upstate New York, which tends to be quite conservative as well. And then in the Senate, Democrats gaining 5 seats, Republicans losing 6. So it looks like it's totally tied on this map, 49 versus 49. But essentially, the Democrats have control, because in Vermont we have Bernie Sanders running as an independent, but he caucuses with the Democrats and is essentially on the left wing of the Democratic Party. Connecticut was interesting because Democrat Joe Lieberman lost in a primary and then made his own party, Connecticut for Lieberman, and won. He continued to caucus with the Democrats. So it really gave the Democrats control over the Senate as well. It's important to note that Bush had lost some conservative support during this period in his second term. He endorsed and tried to push the failed Immigration Reform Act of 2007. This was a bipartisan bill. It would have allowed a pathway to citizenship for undocumented immigrants, which is something the Democrats wanted. Also would have reinforced the southern border and made illegal crossing much more difficult, something the Republicans wanted. It had a lot of momentum, but indeed failed, mostly because of Republican opposition to that idea of creating a path for citizenship for undocumented people. This is a period, too, when there was a lot of I'd say left anger. I put left populist here on the slide, but generally across the left, of mounting disparities of wealth. I have a couple of graphs to show this, but you can see the annual U.S. income share of the top 1%. Notice in 1928, right before the Great Depression, it had reached almost 25%. And then during the Depression, during World War II, during the Cold War period, this share really decreased to under 10%, and then really increased, especially under the presidency of Reagan, but also some ups and downs, but going up under the presidency of Clinton to some degree, and of George W. Bush. A better way to look at this is through the Gini coefficient. So the Gini coefficient, you can do it for either income or wealth. This is income. But it's a statistical measurement. If you have a Gini coefficient of 100, that means one person gets all the income and no one else gets anything. And if it's 0, everyone gets exactly the same amount of income. You can do it on a scale from 0 to 100 or from 0 to 1. It's the same sort of thing, but you can see very, very clearly how in the Roaring '20s, the Gini coefficient had surged, more unequal distribution of income, and then plummeted under the New Deal, under World War II, even in the Cold War period, with some ups and downs, and then really started to grow after the 1970s, and particularly in the Reagan and Bush era. So there's a lot of concern about this. I do want to note, this is a little bit of an excursion, but the income inequality of the United States does not follow the red state, blue state pattern. So the most unequal states are in shades of red here, and you can see New York coming out at the top. Connecticut is also very high. A lot of, and California is as well. Massachusetts is. Illinois fairly high as well. So those are blue state strongholds, but then a lot of very red states in the south. You can see Louisiana here with great high levels of inequality. And then lower levels are in northern New England. You can see Vermont, New Hampshire, and Maine, northern plain states, with Utah having the most equal. Note both Alaska and Hawaii are in the more equal wealth and income distribution side of things. And so you have very red states like Wyoming and Utah here with relatively, I have to stress that, by European standards, they're fairly high, but by U.S. standards, relatively low. But then also very blue states have relatively low inequality, like Hawaii would be a good example, or Maine. 2007, 2008 sees the great financial crisis, followed by what is often known as the Great Recession. This was caused by a number of issues, but it was mostly mortgages. I remember the George W. Bush administration was stressing the development of an ownership society. So they wanted more people to own houses, so mortgage thresholds were reduced. It became quite easy to get a mortgage with very little and sometimes no down payment and without a good credit score. And then those mortgages were all chopped up and sold off as as groups of mortgages, which supposedly would have made those safe, secure investments. But when the economy started to turn down, lots of people started to default, and that led to a banking crisis with the, well, you can see here, housing prices falling almost 32%, and big brokerage firms going bankrupt. A real disaster. And the U.S. Economy actually goes into decline in 2008. So you could see under the George W. Bush administration, economic growth, but not as strong as it had been under Reagan or Bill Clinton, and then going negative right before the election. And in 2008, with this dismal economy, the Democrats have a choice between Hillary Clinton, who was the sort of establishment candidate, wife of former President Bill Clinton. Was widely assumed that she would be sort of next in line for the Democratic nomination. She was challenged by Barack Obama, senator from Illinois, had not been in the Senate very long. It was a very hard-fought nomination campaign. You can see here, if you look at primary votes, virtually identical, but Barack Obama does pull it out. Interesting vote pattern with Clinton doing best in mid-Atlantic states, into the more populated states in New England, well, Massachusetts at any rate, and doing very well in the Southwest. Obama, we'll notice Obama's margins are higher than Clinton in the states he won, and Obama did very well in the Southeast, particularly among black voters, but also in the much of the Midwest, Northwest, North Central states. Anyway, Barack Obama gets the nomination. The Republicans, John McCain, who had come in second place to John Kerry previously, now his reputation as a maverick is seen as a benefit, because the United States is not doing well in the foreign wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, plus the situation of economic crisis. So someone who's seen as a bit of a party outsider, a bit of a maverick, has an advantage in this. He's challenged by Mitt Romney of Massachusetts, who is going to go on and win the next nomination. Romney, more of a centrist in many ways, although a much more sort of an establishmentarian centrist, where John McCain is sort of the more maverick centrist. So a real different orientation, but both are not really in the mainstream of the Republican Party. Mike Huckabee of Arkansas is representing sort of the more religiously oriented conservatives, and Ron Paul of Texas, the more libertarian wing of the party. So you can see that Huckabee did well in the Southeast, a few Midwestern states. Romney in the North. Romney is a member of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, or Mormon, so no surprise he's going to win Utah. He was from Michigan, but had been based in Massachusetts, had been governor of Massachusetts, so no surprise that he won those states. But anyway, John McCain wins the bulk of the states and wins the nomination pretty handily. He has a troubled campaign. He picks Sarah Palin of Alaska, and at the Republican National Convention, Palin gave a very well-received talk, much more of a sort of a populist orientation to her campaign. But it became quite clear that she was quite inexperienced, had been a governor for a pretty short period of Alaska, quite a small state, and didn't have a lot of political experience. McCain also supported the Iraq War and claimed that U.S. troops might have to stay there some 50 to 100 years to make Iraq stable. There were concerns about his age and his health. Also, there were attacks from populists over his wealth. At one point, he was asked how many houses he owned, and he couldn't remember. He said he'd have to get back to the reporter. It turned out he owned 6. And maybe most damaging, he claimed the U.S. economy was fundamentally sound, just right after Lehman Brothers had gone into bankruptcy. Also, a lot of Republican stalwarts did not like his environmental stance. So you can see here with a Stop Global Warming sign, he wanted to have a cap and trade system, capping carbon emissions for different economic enterprises, and then they could trade their sort of carbon credits. This was sort of a market approach to climate change, but there's growing skepticism in the Republican parties about climate change, whether it existed or how damaging it would be, so this didn't help him much. Barack Obama, I have here a couple of his famous campaign posters. He ran very much on a change and hope campaign, quite literally, and campaigned on wanting to end the Iraq War. Initially, he said we need to have a troop surge in Afghanistan because that was the sort of legitimate war, but Iraq was not a legitimate war because Saddam Hussein did not have weapons of mass destruction, and the U.S. needed to get out of that. He also talked about the need for economic recovery, no surprise considering how dismal the economic situation was, and campaigned on tax relief for working families, on renewable energy, which becomes a staple of Democratic campaigns. Healthcare reform failed under Clinton. I thought it was time to bring it back. And also, he was a community organizer before he was a politician, and he emphasized sort of grassroots engagement and empowerment. And he also campaigned on unity in post-partisan politics, which got him a certain amount of, quite a bit of support from centrists. Barack Obama really came to widespread attention in an earlier Democratic National Convention where he gave a speech saying there's no red states, there's no blue states, we're all Americans. So there were a lot of people centrists who really thought he would govern more as a centrist president. It was a decisive victory in 2008 for Barack Obama and the Democrats. Not a landslide, but pretty close to a landslide in the electoral vote anyway, 365 to 173. Popular vote, 52.9 versus 45.7. Here we see Nevada, Colorado going into the Democratic camp. Iowa was really very much a swing state at this time. Most surprising, the two most surprising states were Indiana. You see with its 11 electoral votes. Indiana had been and would become again a very strong red state Republican bastion. But in this election went for Barack Obama, as did North Carolina, as did the swing state of Florida. And you could see Obama taking all of New England, all of the mid-Atlantic states, and all of the Great Lakes states. So a very clear pattern. And the county vote, you can see a return of a lot of areas, at least in the north. You look at Wisconsin there, almost the great majority of the counties going for Barack Obama. The real exceptions were suburban counties around Milwaukee, which continue to be the most conservative suburban area of the country. But most of the farming states there in Iowa, or Wisconsin, Iowa, northern Illinois, going into the Democratic fold. But agricultural rural counties in the South, unless they have a black majority or strong black plurality, have all pretty much by this point switched into the Republican camp. You can see the heavily Latino or Hispanic areas of southern Texas, northern New Mexico, very clearly in the Democratic side. And the blue counties of California moving now into the interior. Previously, it was mostly coastal. We still have coastal Orange County in the south and Del Norte County in the north voting for the Republican candidate, but the coast is pretty much entirely blue, but now the blue extending in. Or in the state of Washington, you can see the west is now almost entirely blue as well. The vote shift map from 2004 to 2008 is very interesting. You can see most of the country very much shifting in a blue direction, as you would expect. Note Indiana, very, across the board in every county, many of them very strongly. You see Michigan, Wisconsin, every county shifting blue. Through most of the West, every county as well. Arizona being an exception, as one would expect, John McCain's home state. But notice the red shifts in the upper South in particular, some in the lower South too, southern Louisiana, mostly Catholic area there. But it's what I want to focus on is area from eastern Oklahoma across Arkansas, Tennessee, northern Alabama, getting into Kentucky, into West Virginia. So these are areas that are mostly white. The black population in the South is mostly further south than that. Although there are some black majority counties that shifted red as well. But it's mostly the white majority counties with, and this could be attributed to racism against Barack Obama, but I think that's a bit simplistic because there has been a general tendency in these areas to move into the Republican camp. Bill Clinton had done very well across Arkansas, his home state, Tennessee, home state of Al Gore, and West Virginia was previously one of the most Democratic voting states in the country, but with an economy heavily dependent on coal as the Democrats increasingly emphasize environmental issues. West Virginia has shifted to become one of the second most Republican voting state in the country. Demographic patterns, I won't go into great detail because it's pretty clear patterns, things we've seen before. Definitely a gender gap, not quite as strong as it had been in a couple of previous elections. The marital status gap appears here, and it's quite clear, and it's going to remain that way, with married people voting much more heavily for, somewhat heavily for the Republican candidate, John McCain. He's at 52 to 47, but non-married, notice that it's a 2-to-1 advantage for Obama and the Democratic Party. We see the same sort of race divide as we saw before, although now Barack Obama getting even higher percentage of the black vote, no surprise. But very high percentage of the Asian vote. By now it's mostly 2-to-1. The Hispanic vote, the other vote. A lot of that other vote is going to be Native Americans or American Indians. And the Hispanic and especially the Native American vote is really shifted more in a Republican direction in the last election, but not in this one. And you can see the only religious category taken by McCain was the Protestant Christian, and Catholics are for Obama, and then other groups, Jewish, none, and other very, very heavily for Obama. The only age cohort McCain took was the 65 and older, took that pretty substantially. That's different today. We'll see that later on. And then the educational attainment, we've seen this quite clearly with a lot of earlier elections. Although this is another measurement that's really changing as the Republicans have moved into the sort of populist group. Well, we could see this really clearly by education, by race and ethnicity, where white with no college degree voted more heavily for McCain. This is a harbinger of things to come, with the whites without college degrees are moving to the Republican Party. We can see it quite clearly here. In Obama's first term, there's an economic rebound from a very deep hole. You can see his first year, major economic decline, but we have economic growth after that. Not exactly sizzling, but considering how deep that recession was, perhaps still impressive to many people. But Obama is still suffering decreasing approval ratings through most of his first term. This Gallup graph has approval on the economy and approval on foreign affairs. So you can see there's a bit of a difference here, generally doing better on foreign affairs than on the economy. But you could see starting out on the economy with 59% approval. And then by 2010, that drops down to 36%. And economic recovery is not as fast as people wanted or hoped for or expected. And no surprise then, whenever you have a situation like this, you can expect House changes. And this was a huge shift, with the Republicans gaining 63 seats in the House, the Democrats losing 63. You can see that dark red on the map. It's over most of the country, not much in the Pacific, one district in southern Washington. But otherwise, the Republicans are gaining a lot in the Southwest, including southwestern Texas, across the northern Midwest. A lot of gains in the South, especially that upper South, white-dominated areas. Big gains in the Midwest. You can see in Missouri and Illinois and Indiana, in Ohio, upstate New York, very clearly as well. And then in the Senate, so this gives the Republicans control of the House, pretty substantial margin, 242 to 193. And in the Senate, Republicans pick up 6 seats. Democrats still have control, but not as close as it had been. And you can see Republicans picking up seats in more conservative parts of the country, like Arkansas and North Dakota, but also in the Midwest, including in Illinois, generally regarded as a deep blue state. In the 2012 Republican contest for nomination, Mitt Romney, who had lost in 2008 to John McCain, emerges as an early favorite. This is a pattern that has been in place in the Republican Party for quite some time, where the second place contender in a previous election turns out to win the majority of primaries and caucuses, and hence the nomination. So Mitt Romney, as I mentioned before, a Mormon, a member of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, originally from Michigan. His father had been a very important political figure there. Moved to Massachusetts, became governor of Massachusetts, and the only way a Republican is going to do that is by governing very much as a centrist. In fact, under Mitt Romney, Massachusetts pioneered a health care reform which would be quite similar to the health care reform that Obama would that Obama pushed through. So there's a little bit of irony there. Rick Santorum of Pennsylvania represented the religious right. Ron Paul of Texas, again, the libertarian right. Newt Gingrich, former Speaker of the House of Georgia, sort of his style of combative conservatism might be the best way to put it. But Romney prevailed. If you look at the electoral map, Romney, very much a centrist figure. The Republicans at this point have reached the consensus that in order to regain the presidency, that they need a more centrist approach, and sort of Romney and a more establishmentarian approach. We can see Rick Santorum, religious conservative, did well in the Southeast and the Great Plains. Libertarian Ron Paul, interesting pattern of Maine, Minnesota, Iowa, and Louisiana. Newt Gingrich in his own Georgia and neighboring South Dakota. But Mitt Romney won most of the primaries and caucuses. He had a number of campaign blunders. With the illustrations, I'll start with the bottom one, CNN, Mitt Romney's severely bad moves. So Romney had a well-deserved reputation as a political centrist, moderate compromiser. He's governor of Massachusetts, but to try to get more support from the Republican base, he stressed that he was a severe conservative. Now was a confusing term. What does it mean to be a severe conservative? Severe conservative, and again went against his persona as well as his voting record. And then he made a comment at a private gathering that was recorded by someone who was serving the food, and it was a gathering of very wealthy supporters. And Romney said that 47% of the people would vote for Barack Obama no matter what Romney said, because those people are dependent on the government, and I'll never convince them to take personal responsibility or care for their lives. So that kind of insult to almost half of the population of the country does not go over well when it is leaked. Also, Romney was mocked by a comment he made in a debate with Obama when he was asked what the major geopolitical threat to the United States was, and he said it was Russia. So here's Salon, a left-wing online news magazine, has a headline here where Obama responded in the debate. I don't know if it's in the debate or later, but he said, yeah, the 1980s called and they want their foreign policy back. Obama zings Romney for calling Russia America's greatest geopolitical threat. Where the consensus was really emerging that China was much more of a geopolitical threat than Russia, although this is interesting and very ironic because in the Trump era, the Democrats would take the opposite view and tend to view Russia, and partly because of events that had happened, right? Russia's invasion of Ukraine, but that's a real sort of switch in the Democratic view of who the major foreign adversary is. In the 2012 campaign, Romney stressed, I should notice here his running mate Paul Ryan, member of the House, who was more of the libertarian wing of the Republican Party, if you will, who really wanted privatization of Social Security, which was nothing that Romney was supporting, but partly because of Romney's moderate centrist position, Ryan would help shore up the more traditional conservative wing of the party. But Romney stressed the need for better economic recovery and more job creation, reduce the deficit. Well, it's easy to say because the deficit was mounting again under Obama with a lot of social spending. Wanted stronger U.S. military pressure against Iran, wanted to reduce income tax rates again by up to 20%, which doesn't exactly go together with deficit reduction. Wanted more energy production in the United States and opposed the Affordable Care Act, Obamacare. This is very ironic because to a certain degree that Affordable Care Act was modeled over what Romney himself had done in Massachusetts as governor. Now, of course, it's quite different if it's a state versus the federal government, but there's still a bit of a disconnect. Obama's main themes were to maintain the economic recovery, to have more health care reform, the DREAM Act, which would allow the children of undocumented migrants who are doing well in school to become U.S. citizens, supporting same-sex marriage, and ending the war in Iraq and beginning to draw down troops in Afghanistan. The election was another solid Democratic victory, slightly smaller margin than 2008. This came as a bit of a shock to Republicans. They thought they were well situated. Romney really thought he was going to win up to the end, even though the polls weren't showing it. But the 2010 midterm elections had convinced a lot of Republicans that they had momentum, and the nation was not really in favor of the Obama administration. But Obama won quite a solid electoral college victory and a pretty solid victory in the popular election, 5 million vote margin. You could see Florida was still very much a swing state at this time, going for Obama. Indiana had gone back into the Republican camp, no surprise. Iowa still in the Democratic camp. And then in the West, in addition to the Pacific Coast states, Colorado now pretty firmly Democratic, New Mexico pretty firmly Democratic, and Nevada going into the Democratic camp as well. Virginia by now is also firmly Democratic. In the House elections in the same year, 2012, the Republicans gained seats, but gained 8 seats, you could see, but still failed to take control. So Nancy Pelosi is the minority leader, and John Boehner, Republican, is House Speaker from Ohio. So a little bit of a problem for the Obama administration. And if you look at the map, you can see the Democrats made a number of gains, particularly in the Southwest, but the Republican gains were scattered around. So overall, greater Democratic gains. You can see now New England, the entire congressional delegation is in the Democratic Party. You can see in the upper Midwest, Wisconsin, Minnesota, Iowa, still mostly, or at least Minnesota certainly mostly Democratic control of House seats. Notice Florida with some important gains for the Democratic Party as well. In the 2012 Senate election, the Democrats gain and solidify control. So Harry Reid of Nevada, now the Senate Majority Leader. You can see 53 to 45 states. You can see the Republicans gained in Nebraska, but the Democrats gained in Indiana, very much a red state, and picking up a couple seats. And note that we have independents in Maine, Angus King, and in Vermont, Bernie Sanders, both of whom caucus with the Democrats, and so can be conceived of as Democrats. And then, in that sense anyway. And then we look at the county level map. It's pretty similar patterns to what we've seen before. You still have a lot of Democratic support in a few areas of the upper Midwest in rural counties. But that's disappeared in many other areas. You can see by now, Missouri, which had been a bellwether state at one time, only a few counties, St. Louis, Kansas City, and Columbia, where the University of Missouri is, but otherwise all red. And you can see how red the red tinge of the county level map in. Well, look at West Virginia. Know every single county now for the Republican Party. Kentucky, Tennessee, almost every one. And the ones that aren't either have large cities like Nashville or have a black majority. You can see central Pennsylvania now deep red. And even though Pennsylvania is still a blue state at this time, mostly because of the urban areas. And if we look at the a purple shaded map, though, we can still see there are a lot of purple areas, but we're moving into more either deep blue or red, or deep red, if you compare this map with some previous ones. And finally, my last slide of the day shows the vote shift from 2008 to 2012. And you can see at the county level, um, more counties shifted, but always take these with a grain of salt because some counties in the United States only have a few hundred people. So it's very misleading if we're not taking population into account. The blue shift in Alaska is quite noticeable. Red shift in coal mining country of eastern Kentucky and West Virginia, very noticeable as well. And in Pennsylvania, energy producing areas now are increasingly going Republican. Interesting, the blue shift, though, in upstate New York, traditionally a very conservative area, and across most of the South. And that's not just in counties with black majorities or large pluralities, it's a number of other counties as well. We still have the heavily Hispanic or Latino counties of South Texas. And not only are they blue, but they've actually blue shifted during this period. No surprise that in heavily Mormon Utah, very much a red shift in this election as well. So that is all for this lecture. We are going to turn in the final lecture, which I hope to post next week, or at least quite soon, which will look at, what we might call the Trump era, the 2016 election, which Trump won very narrowly in the Electoral College and not at all in the popular vote. And then another very close and very contentious election in the COVID year of 2020. And then finally the 2024 election, which we just experienced, where Trump won both the popular vote and the Electoral College. So I hope you can stay tuned for that lecture. Thank you for listening.